Mr. President.
The Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tomorrow will mark the first anniversary of one of the darkest moments in our nation's history. 1 year ago tomorrow, a mob attacked this building, a mob of Americans incited by a sitting United States president who was determined to prevent the peaceful transition of power that is the hallmark of our representative democracy. A mob of Americans savagely attacked and overwhelmed the men and women of the United States Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Departments, smashed their way into this sacred space, and disrupted the joint session of Congress fulfilling its constitutional duty to count the Electoral College ballots awarding the presidency to Joe Biden. January the 6th, like December the 7th and September the 11th, is a date which will live in infamy. I refer to U.S. Capitol as sacred space because it's so much more than a building where the Senate and the House of Representatives meet and conduct business. It is the embodiment of our ideals, our aspirations, and hope, not just to Americans, but also to all of humanity. In the 1960 essay on national purpose for the New York Times and Life magazine, Archibald MacLeish wrote, "There are those who say that the liberation of humanity, the freedom of man and mind, is nothing but a dream. They are right. It is the American dream." Insurrectionists desecrated this sacred space and everything it stands for, including liberty, self-government, and the rule of law. The architect of the Capitol can measure the damage they did to this building in millions of dollars. The damage they did to our moral standing in the world is inestimable. I want to take this moment to acknowledge and pay tribute to the thousands of people who work in Congress or cover it for the press and continue to suffer from the trauma of January the 6th. I'm talking about the brave police officers who protected us. They engaged in a battle one officer described as medieval. 140 of them, including Metropolitan Police Department officers, suffered physical injuries. One of them, Officer Brian Sitnick, died. I imagine that all the officers who defended the Capitol bear the psychological scars of the attack. 4 officers, Howard Liebengood, Jeffrey Smith, Guthrie Hashida, and Kyle DeFreytag committed suicide in the aftermath. But I'm also talking about the staff who work here in the Capitol, in the Senate and House chambers. The doorkeepers, the parliamentarian's office, the bill clerk, the congressional record staff, the floor and cloakroom staff, and so many others. Many of them had to shelter in place. They had to barricade themselves in offices, hoping the police would get to them before the insurrectionists did. I'm talking about the committee and legislative staff in our D.C. offices and back in our state and district offices who watched the attack in horror and disbelief and feared for the safety of their friends and colleagues who answer the phones and hear death threats and obscenities. I'm talking about the food service workers, custodial staff, and other architect of the Capitol and Sergeant of the Arms employees who were caught in the mayhem and then immediately went to work cleaning up the mess, repairing the damage, and providing other essential services, all in the midst of a raging pandemic. I'm talking about the reporters who documented the insurrection at great personal peril after Donald Trump spent the previous 4 years calling them the enemies of the people and openly encouraged his supporters to attack them at his rallies. Congress could not function without the community of patriotic and hardworking Americans. This community is hurting. On New Year's Day, the Washington Post ran an article entitled, "Shaken by the January 6th attack, Capitol workers quit that once made them proud. Quit jobs that once made them proud." What a terrible thing, what a loss to our nation. The danger our nation faced on January 6th has not dissipated. As the New York Times editorial board stated a few days ago, the Republic faces an existential threat from a movement that is openly contemptuous of democracy and shown that is willing to use violence to achieve its ends. The leader of this movement, of course, is Donald Trump. The organizing principle is the big lie that Democrats stole the election. The mindset is what historian Douglas Hofstadter called the paranoid style of American politics, which produces striving for evidence to prove that the unbelievable is the only thing you can believe. The response is nearly non-existent. Voter fraud is to engage in massive voter suppression. The objective is not election reform, it's election repeal. It's important to understand that the insurrection on January 6th was not a spontaneous event. As Ed Gilgore wrote in the New York Times Magazine article entitled, "Trump's Long Campaign to Steal the Presidency, a Timeline," the insurrection was a complex year-long plot, not a one-day event, and it isn't over. Right-wing media personalities and QAnon conspiracy followers feverishly and cynically stoked the movement for their own gain. Elected Republican officials, fearful of Donald Trump's wrath or eager to curry favor with him, enable it. In 1950, Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine issued her Declaration of Conscience in response to another authoritarian bully, fellow Republican Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin. Senator Smith was no fan of the Truman administration, but she said, "To displace it with a Republican regime embracing a philosophy that lacks political integrity and intellectual honesty would prove equally disastrous to the nation. I do not want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of calamity: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. I doubt if the Republican Party could do so simply because I do not believe the American people will uphold any political party that puts political exploitation above national interests. Surely we Republicans are not that desperate for victory. I do not want to see the Republican Party win that way. While it might be a fleeting victory for the Republican Party, it would be a more lasting defeat for the American people. Surely it would ultimately be suicide for the Republican Party and the two-party system that has protected our American liberties from the dictatorships of a one-party system." Mr. President, I urge my Republican colleagues to follow the example of Margaret Chase Smith. There is nothing conservative about advocating force over the rule of law. There is nothing conservative about pledging loyalty to a man over upholding the United States Constitution. I understand that many Americans are disinclined to believe that the President of the United States would blatantly lie to them. But it's exactly what Donald Trump has been doing since he claimed that millions of people who voted illegally cost him the popular vote majority in 2016 election. In fact, his lies go back even further to his vile birther claims about President Obama. We have the opportunity and the imperative for a course correction to save our republic, and that is to restore, expand, and protect voting rights. The Senate must consider S. 2747, the Freedom to Vote Act, and S. 4, the bipartisan John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. On multiple occasions, Senate Democrats voted unanimously just to begin considering these bills to protect people's right to vote, which has come under sustained assault. Each time we have tried to proceed to these measures, every Republican senator has voted to sustain a filibuster. Senate Republicans put gridlock and partisanship before the rights of voters. They are blocking the Senate from having a chance to consider options and amendments and do what the Founding Fathers intended us to do: debate and legislate. Within the next few days, our Republican colleagues in the Senate will have yet another opportunity, a chance to do the right thing. Many senators have worked diligently to come up with compromise legislation that still preserves the essential elements of S1 for the People Act, and the House of Representatives has already passed. President Biden is absolutely correct that we need to enact voting rights legislation to repair the damage the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act. President Biden rightly calls efforts to limit ballot access across the country as the 21st century Jim Crow assault. He warned Americans that the Republican efforts to restrict voting rights as a result of their selfish challenge of the 2020 election results represent the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. In many states, Republican legislatures and governors have responded to the falsehoods of the 2020 election by restricting voting accessibility. Donald Trump's big lie has directly led to disenfranchisement and suppression of the rights to vote of millions of Americans. I urge my colleagues and my fellow American citizens to reflect on the state of our democracy and the rights we hold so dear. A blatant attempt to falsify an election and persistent efforts to deny the American people access to the ballot box has eroded American democracy to a dangerous level and undermined the freedom and liberty that so many Americans have fought to defend and advance. After elections are over and we win, we celebrate. We celebrate the fact that we've garnered the support of the majority of the voters. If we don't win, I think many of us have been involved in campaigns where our candidates have not been successful. We go to work and try to attract more voters in the next election so we can celebrate a victory. That's what participation in a free society is all about. That's what democracies are about. And repressive autocratic regimes never accept the will of the people, so they look at ways in which they can undermine the voting record, what the voters want and the voters will. We should all celebrate the record number of people who cast their ballots in the 2020 presidential election. More Americans cast their votes for the presidential candidate than ever before. After the election, both Democrats and Republicans conducted numerous reviews of the federal, state, and local levels. Those reviews verified the simple fact that there was no widespread corruption or election fraud, that the will of the people prevailed, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were duly elected. Congress and Vice President Pence counted the electoral votes for President and Vice President and did their duty under the Constitution on January 6, notwithstanding the armed insurrection at the Capitol. But that did not stop Donald Trump from promoting the big lie. And that, in turn, has prompted Republican-led states to make it harder for people to cast their votes. The Brennan Center has pointed out that we are in the middle of the worst assault on voting rights since Jim Crow. So what are these laws doing? They're making it more difficult for people to register to vote. They're making it more difficult to vote by mail. They're making it more difficult to vote in person. Republicans apparently believe that demographic trends will prevent them from winning elections. So they are surgically attacking the voting rights of people, mostly people of color, they believe will not vote for them. We have states that have 100% voting by mail. There has been no indication of fraud in voting by mail. But now some states have shortened the time for requesting mail-in ballots, making it more difficult for individuals to vote by mail. They're making it more difficult for people to deliver their ballots by limiting the availability of ballot drop boxes, all because they think that'll be utilized more by people that will not vote for them. The Republicans in charge of these states want to make it harder for people to vote in person, too. Stricter signature requirements, reducing the number of places where people can vote, purging voter rolls simply because a person didn't vote. And the list goes on and on and on. All of these making it more difficult for people to register to vote or be eligible to vote who are more likely to vote for their opponents. Some of these states are even opening up the possibility that election officials can substitute their judgment for the will of the people. The Freedom to Vote Act provides a basic federal floor on protecting the right to vote. The legislation includes common sense items such as automatic and online voter registration, uniform early voting, same-day voter registration, voting by mail and drop box standards, and uniform national standards for voter identification. The Freedom to Vote Act ends political gerrymandering by creating nonpartisan redistricting commissions, requires voter-verified paper ballots and reliable audits, and ends the dominance of big money in political systems by increasing disclosure and transparency. S. 2747 includes two provisions I authored. First, it includes the Democracy Restoration Act, which deals with laws in many states passed at the end of the Civil War. They're still on the books that disqualify a person convicted of a felony from voting for the rest of his or her life. The definition of felony can be quite general in many states, so the impact of these laws fall disproportionately on people of color, which was its intent. There are states where 1 out of 5 black Americans have been disqualified from voting because of a felony conviction, even when that individual has served his or her sentence and has returned to society. We need to remove that disqualification on voting. I am proud that S 2747 also includes my Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act. Spreading false or misleading information or intimidating the electorate remain regularly employed and effective methods to keep individuals, particularly Black Americans and racial minorities, from voting. Advancement in communications, including the rise of social media platforms, have made it easier for bad actors to use these strategies. My provisions prohibit individuals from knowingly deceiving voters about the time, place, eligibility, or procedures of participating in federal election. It criminalizes intentional efforts to hinder, interfere with, or prevent another person from voting, registering to vote, or aiding another person to vote or register to vote. The late John Lewis of Georgia was a dear friend and a former colleague. We first won election to the United States House of Representatives on the same day. Representative Lewis recalled an important lesson that he learned from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "Each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part." Well, Mr. President, we need to follow Congressman Lewis's admonition. We can do our part by passing the bipartisan John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, S4. Congress has an historic and bipartisan tradition of coming together across party lines to safeguard and strengthen the right to vote, which is the bedrock of our democracy. Congress passed and the states ratified the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, which declares that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 15th Amendment also states that Congress has the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. That's exactly what the Senate is trying to do with the John Lewis legislation. The bill will restore key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the Supreme Court severely weakened in the Shelby County versus Holder decisions. 57 years ago, Congress designated the Voting Rights Act to protect equal access to elections for all eligible Americans and passed a measure to respond to widespread disenfranchisement, particularly of racial and language minorities, between the post-war period and the 1960s. S4 would require the federal preclearance for certain changes to voting laws and procedures. It would block changes that restrict the right to vote, particularly changes that disproportionately disenfranchise minority communities. The bill would allow plaintiffs and the Justice Department to bring lawsuits that deny or abridge the voting rights of minority voters and restore legal tools needed to enforce nationwide permanent federal bans on voter suppression efforts targeting minorities. We cannot pass voting rights legislation as long as the Senate Republicans continue to filibuster, even just to proceed to S 2747 and S4. Inaction on voting rights is not an option as we prepare for our 2022 elections, which must be free and fair so that the American people have faith in our elections and their outcomes, particularly after the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. We need to change the filibuster rule. As President Biden just said before the holidays, if the only thing standing between getting voting rights legislation passed and not getting it passed is a filibuster, I support the exception of voting rights for the filibuster. I agree with President Biden. We cannot take action to safeguard voting rights if we don't start right now. States are already drawing their 2022 political boundaries to comply with population changes from the 2020 census. And we cannot start our work unless my colleagues allow us to proceed to this issue on the floor of the United States Senate. I urge my colleagues not to filibuster the right of the United States Senate to start the debate on protecting voter integrity, where each member will have the opportunity to debate the issue and offer amendments. Many senators have offered suggestions about how we can improve these two voting rights bills. Collectively, we have a chance to come together for the American people, something they elected us to do. We will not reach a consensus if we cannot even proceed to the bills. I will support changing the Senate rules, returning the Senate to its historic role of debating and voting on critical issues. Voting rights legislation needs to be debated in the Senate and voted upon by majority vote in the United States Senate. Our noble experiment, representative democracy, is in grave danger. Let us come together and protect the integrity of the Senate, respond to the threat we saw on January 6th last year, and take up and pass voting rights legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor.